Hey, welcome everybody to the B2B Marketing Playbook. My name's Scott Frymire. I'll be your host for this video podcast series where we talk to other marketing leaders, get their insights, opinions, have them answer questions that you as an emerging marketing leader likely have about your own organization or your own role with the business. Today, my guest is a good friend of mine. I've known him for a while. We worked previously together. He has led the demand gen teams for several software companies. Most recently, he joined a company called Vectra in the cybersecurity space as their chief marketing officer. Happy to have him here, Tommy Jenkins. Welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Super excited to be here with you.
Yeah, coming to us from the house of 1,000 guitars there, I see.
During the pandemic, I told everybody it was actually just a Zoom background, so I wouldn't have to answer questions about it. But now I finally have owned up to them, and I say that I'm a passable musician.
Well, I'll resist the temptation to ask you to play for us today. Maybe if we have time at the end, we'll see. Hey, listen, let's dive right in because the topic of today's discussion is around the marketing metrics that really matter to an organization. There's no shortage of metrics that we can look at, right? Some people might look at marketing qualified leads. They might look at the number of deals that were sourced from a marketing lead. We could be looking at maybe some attribution models to try to figure out what the influence that marketing has had on revenue creation, or something like customer acquisition cost, CAC. But Tommy, from your perspective and your experience, if you had to hang your hat on one single metric for marketing to prove that marketing's contribution to the business or ability to impact growth, what would that be?
Yeah, it's a good question. And this is kind of the first problem you have to figure out as a marketing leader. It's what your North Star is, what you're aimed for. And I'll tell you, I had a realization several years ago, a couple of companies ago, that has really changed the way I view things and the way I work within an organization completely. For me, the most important metric that marketing should be worried about is pipeline creation. And I have to give a couple caveats to this when I talk about it, because lots of marketers are measuring pipeline, and I hear a lot of that conversation. So that in and of itself is not unique. But what I've started doing is making sure that marketing's number one most important metric that we're responsible for is the overall amount of pipeline that's created for the business. So that means all pipeline. So if a company needs to generate $100 million in bookings, there's a certain amount of pipeline, a coverage ratio that you need to be able to hit that number. And that's the number that I aim for. And I found that it's really important for two reasons. The first reason is from a business relevance perspective, marketing should be looking at everything, right? There's a lot of stuff that we're good at tracking and can trace from a lead all the way to an opportunity. But if we put blinders on too much, we'll miss the big picture. And the big picture is that the company won't grow if it's not generating enough pipeline. And marketing has to be doing things to make sure that we hit that overall pipeline number. So that's the first reason I care a lot about it. The second reason I care a lot about it is because I know that there's a lot of things that I can't track all the way through the funnel. And I could spend a whole lot of time, and by the way, I have at times in the past spent a whole lot of time trying to close all those loops. But what I found out is that in the end, it doesn't really matter. What matters is the end result. Are we able to generate enough? And I found when I get my teams pointed at that, it's great alignment with the sales teams, and it's a much better conversation about what's needed for the company.
Well, let's talk about that for a second, because you mentioned the alignment with the sales team. I mean, there's definite sort of business cultural implications of this, right? When you have sort of a shared target with the sales team. So what is that? What have those conversations been like in the past for you?
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned that sales shared metric, because that's the number one way I position this metric, is that it's a shared outcome. It's interesting though, sales leaders, they talk a lot about pipeline and pipeline coverage, but generally they talk about what pipeline coverage looks like for this quarter and maybe the next quarter. If you go ask any sales leader right now,
or maybe just this month, right?
Right, exactly. So they've got a good focus there. But what I usually come in and say, and what helps the conversation with sales is I say, that's great that you're focused on that. You should be. We need to hit our number and we need to hit it now. But are we going to have enough pipeline 2 quarters from now, 3 quarters from now, depending on how long your sales cycle is? And so I look at it as my job to go, one, set a plan in place to make sure we're creating enough pipeline, and then do all the motions needed to get us in a good position to create that pipeline. So it's the reason the conversation tends to go well with sales is because it's complementary. They see right away, oh, great, you're going to help me with what comes next, which is absolutely what should be on my radar, and I know I'm not spending enough time thinking about.
Yeah, and I love it because it really forces, if you're truly focused on that number, it forces you to ask the right questions about how you're going to grow the business, right?
Yeah.
Because it is the ultimate metric. How much pipeline do we need? And if we're not getting it, then the questions become, why are we not getting it? Where are we not getting it from? How can we improve that? As opposed to some of the other marketing metrics that may be out there that may be more vanity type metrics.
Well,
So
the
yeah, go
other
ahead.
thing with that, I would say is the other thing I really like about it is it forces many marketers and a lot of my team to be in a very uncomfortable situation. I've shown up at a lot of companies, and it's funny. At every company I've gone to, I've had someone in marketing tell me, uh, "Hey, we're doing all this great stuff. We're generating all these great leads. The sales team just can't close them and execute on them." Someone at every company has told me a version of that. And so, my answer to that is usually, if we're not creating enough pipeline for the company, then there's something that's broken on our end also. And so, this uncomfortable situation is marketers can't declare victory when the company isn't succeeding. And I'm a big proponent of that. I don't ever want to get in the position where my team has like jabbed a flag in the ground and said, "We did it, we won," and then the sales team is going, "No, we didn't." Like, because ultimately that's not a good spot to be in.
And of course, there's nothing that a sales rep will like better than seeing a lot of pipe in their funnel. So that's fantastic. Hey, let me ask you then, when you're going into like an annual planning cycle, are you still reverse engineering off that pipeline number to figure out, well, we're going to need this many marketing leads, marketing qualified leads, sales accepted leads, sales qualified? Are SQLs even a thing at this point anymore, or how do you kind of reverse engineer that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I do still reverse engineer things. What I have landed on at my past couple of companies, which has worked pretty well, is I will take the overall pipeline number that is needed, and then I'll divide it up based on the source of that pipeline. Now, this might be where things would differ from some other marketers, because I would never divide that source between marketing and sales, because I believe it's all the same thing. The sources I divide it by are actually who creates the opportunity, which is usually by role, depending on your org. So it might be field sales or inside sales or the channel, something like that. So you can really concretely go back and look over time to see what channels have been creating opportunity in that way, and then set a plan to say, all right, 30% of my pipeline is going to come from inside sales, 50% is going to come from field sales, and if I did my math the right way, 20% is going to come from the channel. And now marketing needs a plan to help with pipeline for all of those channels. And for some of those channels, you can reverse the waterfall very well. Inside sales is a good example. Um, Inside salespeople work in Salesforce.com all day, every day. You can count on them to do things in the system, receive leads, work those leads, convert them, etc. So that you can see a good funnel through inside salespeople. The channel, no freaking way. Like, you can't track it at all, so you shouldn't even try to reverse the funnel on that. I mean, you might be able to do a little bit of reversal to say things like, if deal reg is a big motion for you, you might be able to say this many deal regs are needed, but after that it gets kind of murky. So I definitely do get those other metrics. You need them because you need to be able to diagnose across the funnel what I have found is that most times that there's a pipeline problem, there's somewhere else in the funnel problem that you can see as well. So even if it's not perfect, you can still you can still see some warning lights going off.
So, Tommy, let me ask you because it sounds in theory it sounds great, and it is right. Getting everybody lined around pipeline generation, but back to the cultural implications. Do you ever run into resistance from the sales side to say, hey, how come we're having to generate X amount of the pipeline from just the sales reps, or maybe sales owns the BDR team versus what marketing's getting from an inbound perspective? I mean, is that ever a conflict when you kind of take this joint metric?
Yeah, it can be. One of the things that is just personally really important to me now is making sure that the sales leaders I partner up with look at the world the same way that I look at the world. I often have described like the job interview process is like dating a little bit, and you're trying to make sure you have a philosophical match. So I always want to talk to the chief revenue officer when I'm going through an interview process with the company, because I want to see philosophically how they look at the world, and if they look at it the same way. What I have found is that most chief revenue officers now, that especially the really good chief revenue officers, they understand that the role of sales and marketing is really kind of a blurred thing. There's a reason why, like, on the balance sheet of many companies, sales and marketing is lumped in together from a cost perspective, because it takes both things to have an outcome that happens. So once you got to frame it in that way of like, let's talk about jointly about how we're going to go do this, and how, well, Siri is listening to me.
It's no
Uh,
problem.
yeah, but once you have that idea that jointly you're trying to solve something, it becomes a little bit easier. Now, having said that, every once in a while, I have to go back and kind of start from the beginning and remember why we're doing this. Remember the big picture of what we're trying to accomplish. So yeah, that still does happen. I tell my team that although I'm in marketing, probably 75% or more of my job is actually sales. It just so happens that a lot of the selling I do is to internal stakeholders, to my own team, to sales leaders, to my constituents, and stuff like that. So I think of that as my job to kind of always be working on that.
And this is a little bit of a side topic, but I am interested in your perspective. Some people might argue, well, shouldn't the chief revenue officer be over sales and marketing then if they have a common shared goal? Should you have one kind of executive position at the executive table who oversees both? I'm just curious your thoughts on that.
I've been in both situations. There's kind of pros and cons of both of them. What I will tell you is that it depends on the type of leader that you could hire to be the chief revenue officer. If the hard part is sales and marketing, while they're very tightly related, they are a little bit different. And a lot of it has to do with the immediacy of things. Sales is about right now, marketing is kind of about the future, having to look out and think a little bit more about the future. And so if you have the right kind of leader who can span both of those things, and I think you probably could. The problem is, from what I've seen, a lot of chief revenue officers are sales leaders. They're leaders who came up in sales and got promoted to that title. And so they don't have the background in marketing. They don't have as much experience with it. And so they won't necessarily be balanced in how they look at things. And so that could be some of the con. But again, if you get the right person, it might be okay. What do you think?
Yeah, you know what? I do agree with you. I think the immediacy is an issue. There's a certain level of checks and balances that have to be there, right? You have a sales leader who may be focused on the month, the quarter. Beyond that, it's like, what do I need to do to make sure, because I have to report back to the board that we hit our number this quarter. What do I need to make sure we do that? Where the marketing leader most often will be even looking beyond that to say, hey, we're building things that may not have an immediate return on investment. Maybe it's some brand building, it's content creation, it's investments in search engine optimization, things that could take a little bit of a longer period to pay off, but once they do, they just kind of snowball on themselves, and in a good way. So I think that checks and balances is probably a good thing to have at the executive level.
Yeah,
Hey,
agreed.
so let me ask you then about something that's been talked about I guess maybe the past decade or so, there's been a lot of focus on the concept of marketing attribution. In fact, there's been whole software companies built around reporting marketing attribution numbers, trying to figure out what each program, which each tactic or offer has influenced in terms of revenue creation and won deals. When you're looking at just pipeline creation as your metric, does marketing attribution still have a role?
Yeah, it's a good question. And what you politely left out of that question was that when we worked together years ago, I was out trying to solve a lot of attribution problems in what I was doing when we worked together. So
I do remember. I do remember.
I'll caveat my answer with that. Um, it's interesting. I think of marketing metrics that fall into two categories. And I now think of them as like an order of operations of which you have to solve. So the first one is it's your plan. It's how you're going to deliver to the plan. And that's what we've talked about before. It's pipeline creation, it's the funnel. It's how do I know I have a plan in place that if we hit these indicators, we are very likely to hit the sales number and therefore the revenue targets for the company. That's the most important. That has to be buttoned up first. What happens though is the second I put that on my marketing team and tell them pipeline's the most important metric, they start trying to hit it, and then they find places where they have problems and they come back to me and say, help, how do I do this? That's where attribution comes in. Now, I think over the years, attribution has gotten a little bit of a bad name, and it's all of our fault as marketers for it getting this bad name. One of the reasons it's gotten a bad name is this concept of credit. A lot of marketers used it like a weapon to go in and take credit for things. Like, let me show you what marketing did, and that that whole conversation never goes very well. It ends in a lot of fights and arguments with the sales team about who did what, and it misses the whole point.
You
Uh,
could argue it might not even be a wise decision to ever talk about marketing attribution with the sales team. It's more of an internal marketing organization metric.
yeah, I love that. I completely agree with you. I use it to try to get an apples to apples view of which marketing tactics to invest in and which to de-invest in. So I only use it for that. And you're right. The only time I would talk to a sales leader about it would be if I was trying to explain some of my decision making of like why I was investing more in one channel or less in another.
That makes sense. And the thing with marketing attribution too, if we dig into that a little bit deeper, and I am a fan of it, I do believe it has that purpose as you stated. But when you start getting into things like what attribution model am I going to use? Am I going to use a U model, a W-shaped model, a flat model? Am I going to go back and look at the last 6 months, the last year, the last 2 years? There's a lot of arbitrary decisions I think in there. I don't know, with your experience with marketing attribution, what's your take as far as kind of how you set up the attribution models?
Yeah, I don't know if this is controversial or not, but I almost think it doesn't matter what decision you make when it comes to that kind of thing. I have set up multiple models, multiple kinds of models in the past. I've even set up multiple models within the same company. And then when I've looked at the results from them, because of a lot of the things you just said about arbitrary decisions you have to make along the way, um, in the end, the output of it doesn't end up being that significantly different. So that's one thing I'd say. The second thing I'd say is it it can be dependent on the type of sales cycle you have. I think if you have a really simple and short sales cycle involving maybe one buyer, then maybe you should spend some more time thinking about which kind of model you're going to use. If your average sales cycle is 30 days or less and it's just one person you're going to be selling to, yeah, you might really wait something like, oh, I really want to understand first touch because I need to acquire people and we're going to close it quickly. But if you're selling to enterprise, if there's a lot of stakeholders involved, a long sales cycle, etc., try it. But I'd be willing to bet you'll look at the data afterwards and go, it didn't really matter.
That's interesting because I've often had that hunch. Unlike you, I haven't really looked at the data from a multiple model perspective to compare over a long period of time to see if those differences are negligible.
Right.
So that's something I think is very interesting. What about metrics? So talking about metrics, what metrics are important, what metrics aren't important. When you're trying to measure things that are a little bit more fuzzy, ambiguous, like brand awareness, what are your thoughts on how you measure that? Is it important to measure, and is there a good way to measure it?
It's a tough one. It's a tough one, especially for people with a demand generation background like I have. It's funny. When I took this job, is my first permanent CMO role. I've been an acting CMO before, but so I called up a bunch of the CMOs I've known and worked with or for in the past to get advice. And it's funny, there was a common piece of advice that more than one person told me. And actually, I think it was three people. All of the people who told me this advice had a strong background in demand. And what they all told me was the biggest mistake they felt like they had made over the years of being a CMO was under investing in awareness. And I think it probably is because of this measurement problem. Like people who are rooted in demand, they want to see their funnel. They want to be able to track exactly how it works. So it is really challenging. I don't think there's a magic metric for awareness. I think you do have to measure, and I think you have to spend a lot of time thinking about the outcome that you're trying to get. So, for example, if if you are, let's say you're in a market that nobody knows who you are at all, and they don't know the problem that your company solves. Well, if you tried to take share of voice, for example, as your most important metric for a company like that, I think you would probably be led in the wrong direction because share of voice is a volume based metric. And mentions, like your company name in a random security article, for example, if you were in the security industry, that's not that's not going to do much because it still doesn't tell people what you do and what problems you solve. So what might be a lot more important as an awareness metric there might be something like something like tier one article mentions, like where you actually where it's I've worked in companies in the past where we've put in a metric that was like impactful articles compared to mentions and things like that. And it's those tier one impactful things that you were aiming for. What about you? This is a tricky one.
Well, it's funny because I think of something similar like social media followers on, let's just say, LinkedIn. And I've worked for companies where somebody put a lot of emphasis on followers as brand awareness, but when you really dug into it, maybe 98, 97, 98% of the followers were people who work for the company, people who were relatives of people who work for the company, maybe some people in the media or vendors, partners. It wasn't necessarily your target audience. So I think there always is, to your point, another layer you have to peel back. Whether you're looking at social media followers or web sessions on your marketing website, right? You might be getting a lot of web sessions. Is it really from the audience that's going to increase that pipeline number?
Yeah, you just made me think about an example of what I've done in the past. So I agree with you about looking at multiple metrics. And um, with awareness, you can't exactly follow that red thread through the whole time. And so you do have to be comfortable with some like implications that, like, hey, this metric moved. And my theory is if this one moves in the right direction, that next metric should move as well. And so you have to string metrics together. And like you, I'll just give you an example from my past. We had was on social media this idea that we needed to get more followers, that would be this help that would drive things down. But wisely, we had multiple metrics. So we had followers, posts, engagement, a whole set of them. And as we went in and started moving followers, we looked at the rest of them and saw that they weren't moving. And that's when you got to go, oh, wait a second, what have we really done if like if engagement and other things aren't moving while we're doing this? So I think looking at that whole ecosystem is really important with awareness.
Hey, by the way, I'm going to go back to something you said not too long ago, which is when you were looking to take on this CMO role for the first time as a full-time CMO, you asked a lot of other people for their opinions, their advice. And I love that because that's exactly the purpose of this video podcast series is for those emerging marketing leaders to be able to get some advice from the people who have been in that seat before
You know what the
and learn from their
coolest thing?
perspective. So
You,
absolutely perfect.
you know what the coolest thing from that experience was? One of the people I talked to shared with me a working Google Doc that he has kept over the years that are like it's like his musings on what he's learned over time. And it was funny because he said the first thing he wrote at the top of it was, I've kept this over time and I'm not editing it, so I contradict myself sometimes in here. And I thought it was just great that he was willing to admit, like, hey, this is what I thought 10 years ago. And you'll see later on in the document, I don't think about it the exact same way anymore.
That's too funny, and I see a book deal in his future if he were to publish that. I think that would be a gold mine of information. So let's move on real quick. A couple other questions. One about maybe metrics that are fool's gold that aren't as important. That might be vanity metrics. Like, are there things that you would recommend that marketers just stop measuring and reporting on?
Yeah, good question. There are a lot of vanity metrics, um, but having said that, many of them are harmless to still report on. Like for example, we were talking about social before. We're talking number of followers. It's a total vanity metric, but it doesn't really do any harm as long as it's not your primary metric. So I wouldn't go so far as say you must absolutely stop this one. But the one that I feel like is completely worthless that you should stop is marketing influence. Like getting to some kind of any kind of conversation where you say marketing influenced X amount of pipeline or X amount of wins, et cetera. To me, it is absolutely complete vanity because it's not at all focused on the outcome for the company. It's a way you could marketing could come back and say, look at this improvement we did that wasn't an improvement for the company. It was just an improvement for this metric. So that's the one that I'd put a stake in the ground and say, not that one. What
Yeah,
about
yeah.
you?
Let's pat ourselves on the back but what are you going to do with that information? What action that's going to improve the business are you going to take with that number? Right.
Yeah.
I totally agree.
What
Totally
about
agree.
you? Any that you?
Well, yeah, certainly I think that there are some in the social media space with followers and such as you mentioned. You know what? You're going to think I'm crazy. Sometimes it's not that I wouldn't report on leads, but I think there's a lot of flexibility with how leads are reported that doesn't benefit the business all the time. And what I've seen, okay, for example, in the past I've worked with third-party content providers, maybe an analyst, maybe a media outlet that was hosting a webinar, and they said, if you come on and sponsor this webinar, we'll let you speak for 2 minutes, but it's on this topic, and you get to talk for 2 minutes, and we're going to pass you 500 leads guaranteed. Oh wow! And as a marketer, says, that's great. I got 500 leads. Well, first, they're not leads. At best, they're suspects. They're contacts, right? In fact, if you really dug into it, you'd probably find that half of them aren't even in your target market, and the other half have given no indication that they're interested in you, that they know about you, or that they have an intent to buy something that you offer. So it's not a lead. It is at best a suspect, probably just a contact. And I've seen marketers take those numbers and say, okay, and just put it in the lead reporting for the month. Now, some of it may sound like semantics, but it can overinflate um, what your potential pipeline could be. The conversion rates are going to go way down because they're not all relevant. So it's not that I'm saying don't report on leads. It's a vanity metric. I'm just saying be careful with how you qualify what a lead is, and is it a qualified lead before you put it into any kind of reporting for the business.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. There's a marketing leader who you and I both know who really hates the word leads, and like he'll jokingly say to me every time I catch up with him, he'll be like, "Did you generate enough leads today?" Like, so I totally agree with you that it can be misleading. Sorry,
Oh, oh.
I couldn't help myself.
Very nice. Well, I'll tell you what. Let me get one more question in here, and the importance of reporting this information back to the business? How do you share the metrics that are important? Obviously, everybody in the sales and marketing organization should have visibility of the pipeline number, but what do you do to share the metrics on a consistent basis with your organization?
Yeah, that is also a really tough question to answer. And I've made some big mistakes in this area in the past by sharing way too much detail. I have made executives' eyes roll back in their head by showing them too much information. So I've really gotten way simpler over time. What I tend to settle on, the first thing I settle on is what I call a marketing scorecard, and it's for those most important metrics, for the pipeline and the funnel metrics. And I try to get that down to really just maybe 3 or 4 metrics that are part of the marketing scorecard. And I report out on it on a weekly basis. And the team has quarterly objectives to it. What's more, I use that scorecard as part of a weekly cadence with sales leadership. And we use it to run the business to say, hey, in Australia, we're behind in pipeline. Well, let's go see where we're behind in pipeline. Oh, it's field sales. So marketing, sales, what are we doing together to help field generate more pipeline in Australia? So I tend to use it in a very hands-on way, and always report out on that overall scorecard performance to the business. The the other metrics that are out there, really, I haven't consistently shared much broader than that. It kind of depends on the executive team and what the company motion is and they're most interested in. So I've been blessed to work for a lot of high growth companies. So high growth companies, they're more focused on the outcomes that you're driving. But if you're working for a company running marketing that's in a really tight economic space, tough market, like trying to optimize, be more efficient and stuff like that, then you're probably going to have to share out those cost metrics and efficiency metrics on a regular basis. But I try to keep it simple. It can be overwhelming, especially to share broadly.
Oh, hey, that sound means we're coming towards the end of this video podcast, but it means it's also time for the same 3 questions I ask of all of our guests. So, Tommy, if you would indulge for a minute, what's the best marketing advice you've ever received?
The best advice. This piece of advice probably has to do just as much with leadership as it does with marketing, but they go hand in hand the same. And uh, it involves how much you have to repeat your message. And so I had a marketing leader tell me, I've had 2 different leaders tell me this. One told me very precisely, you have to say something, whether it be to a buyer, internally, to a stakeholder, whatever, you have to say it 9 times before it will stick. I had another leader who said a different version of the same thing that said, you should be saying the same thing until you are tired of hearing yourself say it. And like I really have marketed that way and led that way now. I find that there is so much noise out in the market. There's so much noise in everybody's lives and internally. So that's probably the best piece of advice. Like repeatability, stick to your message, hit it over and over and over again.
That's great. What about, is there any particular marketing technology or tool that you're absolutely in love with?
I don't know if this will be surprising as a demand gen person, someone with a big background in digital, and someone who's bought a lot of tools in the past. But my answer to that question is no. Um, and my reason is I think at times marketers have gotten a little bit too fixated on tools. And really it's not their fault. All my friends who work at Martech vendors have made this worse on all of us. But if you go read the websites of most Martech vendors, you'll notice 2 things. One, they all start to sound kind of the same. And 2, they all will promise you the whole world of what you will get out of it. And what I've come to believe is that while there's lots of great tools out there, none of them really matter unless you have a great process and team to go adopt the tool. So I'm not married to any one tool. What I found is a lot more important is to understand the problem you have and have a real plan to be able to adopt a tool. I've just seen so many cases of tools failing where the plan wasn't in place.
Yeah, I think that could be a whole topic in itself for a future podcast. Managing the marketing martech stack, right?
You can find someone else for that one.
You got it. Last question. I often in my teams do a start-stop exercise, right? What's one thing that we should all start doing, one thing we should stop doing? So what would your advice be to marketing leaders out there? Give one thing in general, generally speaking, one thing marketing leaders should start doing and do more of, and one thing they should just stop doing today.
Yeah. At the highest level, I think it's probably um, stop selling yourself and your teams short and start focusing on the entire business. A lot of marketers come in and they're focused just on the marketing team. I had a COO tell me one time. He looked at me and he was like, "You're talking about a lot more than just marketing. Like you're talking about how this company works." And I'm like, "Yeah, that is what I'm talking about." Because my realization was I one time tried to make a word cloud of all the things that people expect marketers to be responsible for. And when you look at it that way, it is almost everything that we're expected to be responsible for. So if you put on blinders and are looking at some smaller piece of it and just worrying about marketing, you're selling yourself short. So it's been a great career development thing for me to show up at companies and be having a voice about the whole company and how the whole company succeeds, not just the marketing team.
It's great advice. Hey, Tommy, as always, I always enjoy our conversations. I appreciate the time you spent sharing your perspective. I'd encourage everybody out there, if you want to check Tommy out on LinkedIn, it's Tommy Jenkins, currently CMO at Vectra. Wish you the best with that role. In the meantime, if you have any feedback, any questions, please go ahead and put them in the comments field below the video here. We'll be happy to get back to you. And just a reminder that this podcast series is hosted by Tidewater CMO. It's a fractional CMO services for B2B tech and SaaS companies who are looking to achieve exceptional growth. So check us out, tidewatercmo.com. And I thank everybody for joining us. Look forward to connecting with you again. Take care.